In this video, I want to cover the challenges to the New Deal and how it almost collapsed after Franklin Roosevelt got it started. These are slides 42 to 46 on that PowerPoint. Once Franklin Roosevelt took these pretty decisive actions and made very big government, of course, he got kickback actually from both ends. From the right, from the conservative wing, of course, you had businessmen who were not very happy with the government coming in and directing their businesses or taking over businesses. You also had kickback from, we did have an American Fascist Party and something called the Liberty League, very conservative politicians and people who wanted more centralization, who wanted basically Franklin Roosevelt just to become a dictator and take over. His more serious challenges came from the left. By 3-4 years into the New Deal, after he's reelected in 36, overwhelmingly, he's employed 7-8 million people, but there are still 500,000 people unemployed. He still hadn't solved the problem of the Great Depression, and people are beginning to get worried. Not everybody is being helped. We actually did have an American Communist Party. It was very small, only 15,000 people, but very well organized, and a lot of people sympathized with this. In the middle of the Depression, communism looks pretty good. We're going to guarantee taking care of you. There are people who are asking him to nationalize all business. Basically, exactly what the communists did. On the other hand, after we found out what Stalin was doing in the 1930s in Russia and eliminating and basically executing millions of people, we decided that communism wasn't such a great idea and it lost its popularity. More serious were the socialists. We again had a very large socialist party. They were pretty pragmatic. Workers were not all being helped. Many were, but again, about half were not. And the American Socialist Party was the only organization at the time that was actually supporting civil rights, rights for African Americans who are on the bottom of the barrel in the New Deal. His really serious challengers come from this wing of the party. They are called the neo-populists, the new populists. If you remember, the populists were farmers right before 1900 and the organization just disintegrated. Now we have neo-populists. Again, they are coming from the people, speaking for the people. And the first one is the slide of that Catholic priest who's talking to a crowd. This was Father Charles Coughlin. He was a Detroit radio priest, and his audience was 30 million people. Again, this is in a population of about 150 million. So if you're talking about 30 million people, mainly adults, listening to him, this is a guy who has a lot of clout. The equivalent today, Sean Hannity, Rush Limbaugh, possibly, I think. But this is the only media they have is radio, so there wasn't any alternatives at the time. What did he propose? He proposed nationalizing the banks. He proposed nationalizing all the utilities. The federal government should just come in and take them and run them. He also supported an old populist program, the unlimited coining of silver, because we were back on the gold standard. Turned out he lost some support as time went on because he was incredibly anti-Semitic. He was one of the people who was blaming the Jews for causing the Great Depression, for all the problems in America. So he did lose popularity as time went on. The second guy is that older man sitting at a desk, and this is Francis Townsend. He was a medical doctor and a very nice guy. Doesn't look like a rabble-rouser or radical. And he lived in California. He, because he was older, had many patients who were also older. Depression comes along. Most of his patients are broke. They couldn't pay for a doctor. They couldn't pay for food. He kept on treating them. He was a real humanitarian. He never asked for payment unless they could afford it. Most of his patients were broke. They couldn't afford to pay him in the first place. His concept, because he was treating mainly older patients, was that older people should get a government pension. He was proposing $200 a month, which was enough to survive on. Anyone over 60 should get $200 from the government. How are you going to pay for this? He proposed paying for it by a national sales tax. This was wildly popular, you can imagine, particularly with older people, and clubs were established all over the country, Townsend clubs. They collected petitions, and 10 million signatures were signed on petitions and sent to Washington, D.C., proposing basically an old age pension. You get 10 million signatures on anything. If we had 10 million signatures on a petition today with 2 to 3 times the population, Washington would pay attention. Washington did pay attention. Franklin Roosevelt paid very close attention. If this sounds familiar, this is the basis of Social Security. Franklin Roosevelt copied it and created Social Security. The third guy is the most dangerous. And if you want to understand the appeal of Huey Long, who was the governor of Louisiana, I would suggest Googling or go to YouTube. There is a video of Huey Long, Share the Wealth. It's a speech that lasts 2 minutes, and it shows Huey Long very clearly why he had such appeal. He was incredibly charismatic. He was ruthless. But he was a populist. He was wildly popular in Louisiana. If you scroll down a couple slides down after that, you can see the headlines at his funeral. 10,000 people in New Orleans showed up for his funeral. He is also a demagogue. He is basically a variety of a dictator. His program was Share the Wealth. And it created clubs with 7 million members in them across the country. This verges into pretty serious government involvement, I would say borderline communism. What does Share the Wealth mean? Huey Long was guaranteeing, the speech is really good, you really need to watch that 2 minutes. He was guaranteeing a house, a car, a free education, and a guaranteed income by seizing, how do you pay for this? By seizing all private assets in the country over $5 million and 100% tax over $1 million income. This is not quite complete government takeover, but gets pretty close to that. So if you had a company, let's say Standard Oil, that was worth over $5 million, the government would leave you $5 million worth and take the rest and take over on that company. If you made over $1 million, the government taxed it at 100%. Okay, today our top tax on income is something in the low 30s. During World War II, the top tax on income, people who made a lot of money, was 90%. So we came close to this in World War II, actually, because Americans don't like the government taxes. In Europe, again, top taxes, if you're fairly wealthy, top taxes in Scandinavia are 50 to 60%. I know that firsthand from Finnish friends of mine. People are not trying to flee Scandinavia, they're trying to get into Scandinavia. Why? Sounds like a lot of tax money, and it is. Don't forget, university and all education, starting from preschool through university, is free, and healthcare is socialized medicine. Your healthcare is guaranteed. So you can do the math here. Scandinavians don't mind it. We do. We're Americans. He assumed that Huey Long was his biggest threat, his biggest problem. What happened to Huey Long, because he's incredibly charismatic, is he was assassinated. He was talking about running for president. Huey Long probably couldn't have won, but he could have split the vote, just like 1912, and then Roosevelt would have lost. So this is what Roosevelt's concerned with. Fortunately for Roosevelt, unfortunately for Huey Long, he was assassinated, not by political opponents, but by the brother of a girlfriend that he had basically dumped. He was not only incredibly charismatic, he was a serious alcoholic and my favorite word, man whore. He had a number of affairs. Brother of one of the girls got pissed off at him, blew him away on the courthouse steps. His bodyguards turned around and killed the guy. They were both lying on the courthouse steps, assassinated. So he has challenges from the right and the left. What does Franklin Roosevelt do about it? Basically, he adopted a lot of the programs that were proposed by his critics, his more liberal critics, that wanted him to do more. The 36th election comes along. It is the first election in American history that's strictly along class lines, poor versus not poor. Franklin Roosevelt campaigns on the four freedoms, that Americans should have freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from fear, freedom from want. And basically, the 36th election is a referendum on the New Deal. People are voting on the New Deal. Should we continue it? Should we try something different? The results were not surprisingly overwhelmingly for Roosevelt. He took 46 out of 48 states, not Vermont and Massachusetts. Who voted for Roosevelt? This is the New Deal coalition, which still exists today. 80% of workers, including 70% of Texas, by the way, Catholics, Jews, religious minorities, African Americans over 80%, immigrants, working people, blue collar, basically anybody who is not wealthy or not a serious or large business owner. In other words, the country is overwhelmingly saying, yes, Roosevelt, not only is the New Deal working for us, but we want more. His second inaugural address, I see a third of a nation ill-housed, ill-clad, ill-nourished, and he knows his job is to continue the New Deal and fix the rest of the problems. He is not resting on his laurels. He's not saying, here's the great job I'm doing. He's saying, this is the challenge. We have to continue with this. If you look at the New Deal coalition, this is still pretty much operative for the Democratic Party today. Who votes Democrat today? Immigrants, minorities, blue-collar workers. There's regional differences, but the New Deal coalition is still pretty much in effect. And it started in the Great Depression. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Stay safe again. Thanks.